Nobody inside the Moretti estate understood why Damien Moretti was in such a terrible mood. By 9:30 that morning, 3 bodyguards had already been reassigned to warehouse duty after making minor mistakes. One trusted captain had nearly lost his position for interrupting a meeting half a second too early. A negotiation involving an $8 million shipping contract had been postponed because Damien abruptly walked out before anyone finished speaking. The mansion had fallen into complete silence. Staff whispered only when absolutely necessary. Footsteps became softer. Doors closed more carefully. Even the chefs lowered their voices in the kitchen. The gardeners worked without their usual whistling. The maids moved through the hallways like ghosts, barely breathing, terrified of drawing attention. Everyone assumed someone had betrayed the Moretti family. After all, Damien Moretti wasn't known for losing his temper without reason. He was known for something far worse: control. The man had once negotiated with rival syndicates while a gun was pointed at his chest without changing the tone of his voice. He had buried enemies without blinking. He had stared down federal investigations with the same calm expression he used while drinking his morning espresso. Fear simply wasn't an emotion people associated with Damien Moretti. Until today. Inside his office, another expensive fountain pen cracked between his fingers. Black ink spattered across the polished mahogany desk, pooling around a stack of contracts that would never be signed. Marco DeSantis, Damien's longtime underboss, quietly glanced at the broken pieces before pretending not to notice. No one commented. No one breathed louder than necessary. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like drowning. Damien stared through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the estate grounds, but he wasn't seeing the gardens. He wasn't seeing the perfectly manicured hedges, or the fountains, or the imported Italian marble pathways. He was seeing an empty breakfast chair, a chair that had been empty for exactly one morning, yet felt like it had been vacant for years. Every morning for nearly 3 years, someone had walked into his study carrying black coffee, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and exactly 2 slices of orange because his physician insisted he needed more vitamins. Every morning, Leo reminded him to eat. Every morning, Damien ignored him. Every morning, Leo ignored his refusal and quietly placed the plate where Damien couldn't avoid seeing it. Eventually, he always ate. Not because he was hungry, because Leo would smile whenever he returned later and found the plate empty. That smile, small and warm and utterly genuine. It had become the highlight of Damien's mornings, the one moment of peace in a life consumed by violence and strategy and endless calculation. He had stopped questioning why the scent of fresh bread made his alpha instincts purr with satisfaction. He had stopped wondering why his chest tightened whenever Leo laughed. He had stopped analyzing why he always made sure to finish the entire loaf, even when he wasn't hungry, just to see that pleased expression on Leo's face. He had stopped questioning everything. Until this morning, Leo had been strangely quiet. No teasing reminder about his medication. No gentle argument over coffee. No fresh loaf cooling on the kitchen counter. No scent of vanilla and honey drifting through the study door. No soft footsteps approaching with breakfast. And for reasons Damien refused to examine too closely, the entire estate suddenly felt colder. Emptier. Wrong. A soft knock interrupted the suffocating silence. 3 measured taps. Polite. Hesitant. Familiar. Marco looked toward the door. So, a timid voice answered from outside. Sir? May I come in? Something shifted in Damien's expression. Barely noticeable, but Marco saw it. The tight set of his jaw relaxed by a fraction. The ice in his eyes thawed slightly. His alpha instincts, which had been snarling with restless agitation all morning, quieted to a low hum of recognition. So it's him, Marco thought. Thank God. Come in. The heavy oak door opened slowly. Leo Brooks stepped inside, carrying a neatly organized stack of housekeeping reports against his chest. He wore the same simple uniform he had worn almost every day for 3 years. Navy trousers, a crisp white button-down, soft-soled shoes that made no sound on the marble floors. His chestnut hair was tied into a loose bun, a few stubborn curls framing his round, gentle face. His warm smile appeared almost apologetic, as though he were worried about interrupting people far more important than himself. His omega scent, sweet vanilla and honey with an undertone of fresh bread, was muted today, subdued, as though he were trying to make himself smaller, less noticeable. Leo thanked every gardener by name, remembered every employee's birthday, brought soup to 6 security guards without telling anyone. Half the estate quietly believed he was the kindest person living behind the mansion walls. The other half secretly wondered how someone so warm had survived 3 years working for Damien Moretti. But Damien knew the truth. Leo hadn't just survived. Leo had thrived. He had carved out a space for himself in the cold, dark heart of the Moretti Empire and filled it with warmth. He had become something Damien hadn't realized he needed until this morning, when he woke up and realized Leo wasn't there. He stopped a respectful distance from the desk. "I'm sorry for interrupting." Damien finally looked at him. "What is it?" "I finished organizing tomorrow's guest rooms." Damien nodded once. "The inventory reports are updated." Another nod. "The kitchen requested approval for next week's grocery order." Marco blinked. 5 minutes ago, Damien had nearly exploded because someone spoke during a meeting. Now he was patiently listening to grocery updates. Nobody dared react. Nobody dared breathe. Leo hesitated. He shifted his weight nervously, fingers tightening around the folder. His scent flickered with anxiety, barely perceptible, but Damien caught it instantly. His alpha instincts prickled with concern. Something was wrong. "There is one more thing," Leo said quietly. Damien noticed immediately. Leo almost never hesitated. He was always confident, always sure of himself, even when delivering bad news. But now he looked like a man preparing to jump off a cliff. "What?" Leo lowered his eyes. "I was wondering." His fingers tightened slightly around the folder. "If it wouldn't cause too much trouble." Marco suddenly found the carpet fascinating. Every instinct told him this conversation mattered far more than the business meeting waiting downstairs. He could feel the shift in the room, the subtle tension coiling around Damien like a snake preparing to strike. Leo took a slow breath. "I may need to leave work an hour early today." The room became completely still. Damien rested both hands on the desk, his knuckles whitening. For what reason? A faint blush warmed Leo's cheeks. He smiled, small and shy, almost embarrassed. "My best friend finally convinced me to meet someone." He laughed softly, a nervous sound. "It's only dinner." Another tiny pause. "I have a date tonight." Silence. A sharp crack echoed through the office. Everyone looked down. Damien's fountain pen had snapped cleanly in half. Dark ink slowly spread across the polished mahogany desk. No one moved. No one breathed. The silence stretched like a wound. Marco had watched this man survive ambushes. He had watched him negotiate peace between families who had spent decades trying to kill each other. He had watched him stare down federal agents with the cold, unblinking confidence of a predator. He had never seen Damien Moretti stare at a broken pen as though it had personally betrayed him. He had never seen the alpha's composure crack so completely, so publicly. He had never seen that expression on Damien's face, a mix of shock and fury and something that looked almost like grief. When Damien finally spoke, his voice was calm. Far too calm. "A date?" "Yes." "With whom?" Leo smiled apologetically. "I actually don't know much about him yet. My friend Caleb arranged everything. They've only spoken online." Marco's stomach tightened. Damien's jaw flexed once, the muscle jumping beneath his skin. "You've never met this man?" "No." "And you're planning to have dinner alone with him?" "I know it sounds a little old-fashioned." Leo laughed again, the sound brittle and nervous. "But Caleb says he's very kind. He's been talking to him for weeks. Apparently he's charming and funny and—" "You're an Omega, Leo? Alone? With a stranger?" Leo's smile faltered. I know. But Caleb wouldn't set me up with someone dangerous. He's my best friend. He wouldn't. People you trust can be wrong." Damien's voice was sharper than he intended. He saw Leo flinch and forced himself to breathe. "You have no idea who this man really is." I'm not going to be reckless, Leo said softly. It's just dinner. In a public place. I'll be fine. For several long seconds, Damien said nothing. His expression remained unreadable. Only Marco noticed the subtle widening of Damien's knuckles as his hand slowly closed around the broken pen. Only Marco noticed the way Damien's alpha scent spiked with barely restrained fury, possessive, territorial, primal. Then Damien leaned back, forcing his shoulders to relax. You may leave early. Relief instantly brightened Leo's face. Thank you, sir. He turned and quietly left the office. The door clicked shut. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared. Finally, Damien looked toward Marco. Find out everything. Marco frowned. About the restaurant? Damien's eyes turned colder than winter. No. About the man who thinks he's taking Leo Brooks to dinner. Marco understood immediately. This was no longer about a blind date. Somewhere deep inside, the city's most feared alpha had just declared war against a man whose name he didn't even know yet. This was about possession, about territory, about something far deeper than any business deal or criminal rivalry. The office remained silent long after Leo left. Marco waited. He had worked beside Damien Moretti for nearly 15 years. He knew better than to speak first when his boss wore that expression. The expression of a predator who had just discovered another animal in his territory. Damien slowly wiped the spilled ink from his desk with a folded handkerchief. His movements were precise, controlled. Anyone walking into the room would think nothing had happened. Only Marco noticed the tiny fragments of the shattered fountain pen still embedded in Damien's palm. A thin line of blood ran across his fingers. He didn't seem to notice. Finally, Damien spoke. Gabriel. The head of intelligence appeared almost instantly from the adjoining office. Unlike the armed captains who commanded soldiers, Gabriel Russo commanded information. If something existed inside the city, Gabriel could usually find it. He was tall and lean, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and the patient stillness of a spider waiting for prey. You called, boss. Damien nodded once. I need everything on a man. Gabriel pulled out a tablet. Name? I don't have one. Occupation? I don't know. Address? No. Gabriel looked up. What do we have? Damien's voice remained calm. He has dinner with Leo Brooks tonight. Gabriel blinked. Marco lowered his head to hide the smile, threatening to appear. After a brief pause, Gabriel carefully asked, Is this an official security concern? Damien answered without hesitation. It is now. Within seconds, Gabriel began issuing encrypted messages. Restaurant reservation databases. Private investigators. Facial recognition alerts. Transportation records. Social media scraping. Financial trail analysis. Every available resource quietly shifted toward finding one completely ordinary man. Meanwhile, Leo had absolutely no idea. He hummed softly while changing the linens in the guest wing, his omega scent brightening with nervous excitement. One of the younger housekeepers, Olivia Hayes, watched him with a grin as she folded towels in the hallway. You've smiled all morning. Leo laughed. Have I? You definitely have. Olivia leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. So what? Tell me everything. There isn't much to tell. You have a date. Olivia's grin widened. You, Leo Brooks, the most dedicated employee in this entire mansion, have a date. With a man. Outside these walls. This is monumental. Leo covered his face with both hands. Please don't say it so loudly. Olivia laughed. I've worked here 2 years and have never seen you interested in anyone. Not once. You turn down every invitation. You never even look at the security guards, and half of them are very attractive. I'm not interested in them. Then why are you going? Leo carefully folded the final blanket, smoothing out every wrinkle. Caleb says I spend too much time working. He's probably right. And he thinks I deserve at least one nice evening. One night where I'm not worrying about laundry or inventory, or whether Mr. Moretti remembered to eat dinner. Olivia smiled warmly. I agree. You do work too hard. You've been here 3 years, and you never take time off. You're always helping someone, always baking, Always checking on people. When was the last time you did something just for yourself? Leo opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. The truth was, he couldn't remember. His life had become the estate, the routine, the familiar comfort of his duties. And Damien. Always Damien. I don't know, he admitted quietly. Olivia hugged him. Then tonight is going to be wonderful. I can feel it. Leo looked around the enormous guest suite, the silk drapes, the antique furniture, the crystal chandeliers. Sometimes he forgot how unusual his life had become. 3 years earlier, he had accepted the housekeeping position simply because it offered stable income and housing. He was a young Omega from a small town, no family to speak of, no prospects. The job had been a lifeline. He expected cold employers, strict schedules, luxury beyond anything he had ever imagined. He certainly hadn't expected Damien Moretti. The newspapers described him as ruthless. Television called him dangerous. Business magazines labeled him untouchable. But the Alpha Leo saw every day looked lonely. He worked before sunrise. He often skipped lunch. He answered emails during dinner. Half the time, Leo doubted he even noticed how exhausted he looked. He never smiled. He never relaxed. He never seemed to let anyone close. Someone had to remind him to slow down. Eventually, that someone became Leo. At first, he reminded Damien because he was doing his job. Then because nobody else would. Then because he couldn't bear the thought of that powerful, terrifying alpha collapsing from sheer exhaustion. Leo started bringing him coffee. Then bread. Then oranges. He started leaving warm loaves outside his study door. He started cooking his favorite meals. He started watching him eat, just to make sure he actually did. He smiled to himself. He'll probably forget dinner again tonight. Olivia noticed. What are you smiling about now? Oh, nothing. You're thinking about him, aren't you? About Mr. Moretti. Leo's cheeks flushed. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you don't. Across the estate, Damien stood inside the mansion's private security room. Dozens of surveillance monitors covered one wall, displaying every corner of the property in high definition. Most displayed gates, warehouses, loading docks, and shipping facilities. One screen showed the mansion's main kitchen. Leo crossed the room carrying a tray of freshly baked bread, his movements graceful and efficient. He stopped to hand a warm roll to one of the gardeners before continuing on his way. His Omega scent, faint even through the cameras, seemed to brighten the room. Damien watched in silence, his alpha instincts humming with possessive satisfaction. Marco quietly stepped beside him. You know, this is becoming slightly obsessive. Damien never looked away. He's too trusting. Marco folded his arms. Or maybe he's simply kind. Maybe he sees the good in people because that's who he is. Not everyone is a cynic, Damien. Kind people die first. Marco sighed. There it is. The Mafia answer. Damien finally turned. You disagree? I think you're looking for reasons. Damien's eyes narrowed. What reasons? To convince yourself this has something to do with security. Marco met his gaze steadily. You're not worried about an Omega's safety. You're jealous. You're terrified that someone else might take him away from you. And instead of admitting that, you're constructing elaborate rationalizations about threats and infiltration. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Damien's jaw tightened. His sense spiked with something raw and defensive. Then Gabriel entered carrying a tablet, his expression grim. I found him. Both men looked up immediately. The restaurant reservation was made through Caleb Bennett. He placed the tablet on the table, tapping up a profile. The date's name is Ethan Cross. 32 years old. Claims to work in international logistics. No criminal record. No outstanding warrants. No financial irregularities. Clean as a whistle. Marco raised an eyebrow. So clean. Gabriel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he enlarged several photographs. Driver's license photos, security footage, social media profiles. Too clean. Damien understood instantly. What did you find? Ethan Cross doesn't exist before 18 months ago. Marco frowned. What do you mean? I mean exactly that. Gabriel zoomed into several government databases. Driver's license issued 18 months ago. Tax history begins 18 months ago. Employment history begins 18 months ago. No childhood. No university records. No medical files. No photographs before that date. It's as if he was born 18 months ago, fully formed and ready to go. Marco's smile disappeared. A manufactured identity. Gabriel nodded. Professional grade. Someone spent a lot of money and time building this. The documents are perfect. The references check out. If I hadn't dug deeper, we'd never have known. Damien stared at Ethan's smiling photograph. Average height. Well-dressed. Pleasant smile. Exactly the kind of man nobody remembered seeing. Which made him dangerous. Gabriel continued. I kept digging. The identity traces back to a consulting firm in the financial district. The consulting firm belongs to a holding company registered offshore. He paused, his fingers flying across the tablet. Damien finished the sentence himself. Belongs to Victor Salvatore. Gabriel nodded. The rival syndicate. The room grew silent. Victor Salvatore had spent years trying to penetrate Moretti operations. He bribed politicians, bought shipping inspectors, placed informants inside construction companies, but never inside the mansion itself. Never this close. Marco slowly exhaled. You think Leo is the target? Damien shook his head. No. He's the doorway. He's the access point. They don't want to hurt him. They want to use him. To get to me. His voice dropped, colder than ice. To get inside my home. At that exact moment, miles away in a quiet apartment, Leo stood in front of his bedroom mirror, turning this way and that. Caleb Bennett adjusted the collar of Leo's soft blue button-down, smoothing out invisible wrinkles. You look beautiful. I look nervous. That's normal. Caleb squeezed his shoulders. This is exciting. A real date. A handsome man. A nice restaurant. This is what normal people do. What if he doesn't like me? Caleb laughed. If he has functioning eyes, he'll like you. You're adorable. You're kind. You're funny. You bake like a goddess. What's not to like? Leo smiled shyly. I haven't been on a date in years. Then tonight is the beginning of something wonderful. Caleb hugged him tightly. I promise. You deserve this, Leo. You deserve someone who sees how amazing you are. Neither man noticed the black luxury sedan parked across the street. Inside, a man wearing an earpiece quietly lowered his binoculars. He pressed a single button. Target is preparing to leave. A cold voice answered through the speaker. Excellent. Phase 1 begins tonight. The early evening sky glowed with soft shades of gold and rose as Leo stepped out of the apartment building. He paused on the sidewalk and took a slow breath. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the distant sounds of traffic and laughter. It had been years since he had dressed for anything other than work. The blue shirt Caleb had chosen wasn't expensive. It was simple, comfortable, elegant in a quiet way. For the first time in a long while, Leo looked at his reflection in the glass door and smiled. Maybe tonight would simply be normal. Maybe he could have one ordinary evening. One moment of happiness that didn't involve worrying about the estate or the staff or Damien. Caleb squeezed his arm. Stop worrying. I'm trying. No thinking about laundry. No worrying whether Mr. Moretti remembered dinner. No wondering if someone folded the guest towels correctly. Leo laughed. I don't think like that. Caleb raised an eyebrow. You absolutely do. I've known you for 10 years. You think about everyone except yourself. Tonight, I want you to be selfish. Just for a few hours. Leo opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. Perhaps Caleb was right. For 3 years, the estate had become his world. He knew every hallway, every employee, every gardener, every cook. He even knew which lights Damien preferred left on when he worked late into the night. Without realizing it, his routines had quietly become part of Leo's. His moods had become Leo's weather. His loneliness had become Leo's burden. But tonight, just for tonight, he would try to be his own person. Across the city, Damien stood beside a black SUV parked opposite the restaurant. Marco leaned against the vehicle with folded arms, his expression a mix of exasperation and amusement. This is your final chance. Damien didn't answer. You could still leave. Go back to the mansion. Pretend this never happened. Silence. Marco sighed heavily. You know what a normal alpha would do? Damien looked at him, his eyes flat and cold. He'd admit he's jealous. He'd tell his Omega how he feels. I am not jealous. Marco almost laughed. You postponed an $8 million contract. You ordered background investigations on a stranger. You've placed surveillance around an entire restaurant. And you haven't blinked in 20 minutes. If this isn't jealousy, I'd hate to see what is. Damien's expression remained unreadable. I protect people under my roof. Marco smiled knowingly. Only one of them. Before Damien could respond, Gabriel's voice came through the earpiece. Boss, Ethan has arrived. Damien looked toward the restaurant entrance. A silver sedan stopped beside the curb. A tall man stepped out. Perfectly tailored suit. Relaxed smile. Confident posture. Calm, measured movements. Nothing about Ethan Cross appeared threatening. That bothered Damien even more. Professional predators rarely looked dangerous. They looked trustworthy. They looked kind. They looked exactly like the kind of man a sweet, trusting Omega like Leo would feel safe with. He's alpha, Damien said flatly. I can tell from here. Marco nodded. So he shouldn't be. Leo deserves to choose. Marco's voice was quiet but firm. You can't make that choice for him, Damien. No matter how much you want to. Inside the restaurant, Leo stood nervously as Ethan approached. The alpha was taller than he'd expected, with broad shoulders and a charming smile. His scent was neutral, pleasant, unthreatening, deliberately subdued. Leo felt himself relax slightly. You must be Leo. His smile seemed warm. Genuine. Leo smiled back politely. And you must be Ethan. It's nice to finally meet you. The pleasure is mine. Ethan pulled out his chair before taking his own seat. Caleb has told me so much about you. He said you work at the Moretti estate? That must be fascinating. Leo nodded, settling into his chair. It's a job. Nothing too exciting. I disagree. Any position in that household must be interesting. The Moretti family is legendary. For the next 20 minutes, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. Ethan asked about Leo's hobbies. Leo spoke about baking, about his love of fresh bread and pastries. Ethan laughed at his stories about accidentally burning cookies during his first week at the estate. Leo admitted he loved gardening, that he found peace in working with his hands. Ethan claimed he did too. The conversation flowed easily. Outside, Gabriel quietly handed Damien a tablet. I found something. Damien glanced down. Security footage. Different cities. Different restaurants. Different Omegas. Ethan appeared beside each of them. Always smiling. Always charming. Always disappearing several weeks later. Each Omega was young, attractive, sweet-natured. Each worked in proximity to powerful alphas. Marco frowned. Who are they? Gabriel answered softly. Employees. Executive assistants. Receptionists. Bookkeepers. Personal secretaries. Omegas working close to powerful businessmen. Politicians. Crime bosses. Damien's eyes darkened. A pattern. Gabriel nodded. We've confirmed 6. There could be more. Every one of them disappeared after a few weeks of dating Ethan. Some were found. Some weren't. Where were they found? Various places. Usually drugged, disoriented, but alive. They'd been interrogated, coerced, used for information. Then they were discarded. Marco's face paled. God. Damien's alpha instincts roared with protective fury. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. He touched Leo. He's sitting across from Leo right now, smiling at him, pretending to be kind. Inside, the waiter arrived carrying dinner. Leo relaxed a little. Maybe Caleb had been right. Maybe he had worried for nothing. Ethan listened carefully whenever he spoke. He complimented Leo's baking, asked thoughtful questions, never interrupted. He seemed kind. He seemed safe. Then came one small question. So, you work at the Moretti estate? Leo smiled. Yes. It must be beautiful. It really is. The gardens are incredible, and the architecture. How many people live there? Leo hesitated. The question was innocent enough, but something about it made his instincts prickle. I'm not really supposed to discuss work. Ethan immediately raised both hands. Of course. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to pry. His apology felt sincere. His scent remained calm. Leo smiled again. No harm done. Across the room, a man sitting alone lowered his newspaper. Tiny camera hidden inside a button. Microphone concealed beneath the table. Every word had been recorded. He quietly texted one sentence. Target is comfortable. Proceed to phase 2. Minutes later, Ethan casually continued the conversation. I always admire people who work for successful families. It must be fascinating to see that world up close. Leo shrugged. It's mostly cleaning, cooking, helping wherever I'm needed. And Mr. Moretti? Leo looked surprised. What about him? Is he really as intimidating as people say? Leo smiled despite himself. He can be, but... He stopped. But what? He looked down at his tea. I think people misunderstand him. Outside, Damien froze. Marco slowly turned toward him. Did he just defend you? Damien didn't answer. His eyes never left the restaurant window. His alpha instincts purred with a mixture of shock and possessive satisfaction. Inside, Ethan leaned forward with genuine interest. So he's actually a good man? Leo considered the question carefully. I don't know if good is the right word, but I've seen him pay medical bills for employees without telling anyone. I've seen him attend funerals when workers lost family members. I've seen him remember birthdays he pretended not to care about. He paused, a soft smile touching his lips. He hides it, but he's kinder than people realize. For the first time all evening, Damien lowered his eyes. His chest ached with something that felt terrifyingly like hope. Marco smiled quietly. He sees you. The real you. Before Damien could respond, Gabriel's phone vibrated sharply. His expression changed instantly, the color draining from his face. What? Marco noticed first. What happened? Gabriel turned the screen toward Damien. Satellite tracking. Encrypted messages. Known associates. One photograph. Victor Salvatore's chief lieutenant entering an underground parking garage beneath the restaurant. 10 minutes earlier. Damien's voice dropped into the cold tone his men feared most. He's here. Gabriel nodded. Our surveillance team just lost visual. This was never just Ethan. This is an extraction team. They're planning to take Leo. Damien opened the SUV door. Move. Inside the restaurant, Leo laughed as Ethan told another story, something about a disastrous business trip to Barcelona. He never noticed the waiter, who wasn't really a waiter. The man quietly placed a fresh glass of sparkling water in front of him. His sleeve brushed the rim for less than a second. Almost invisible. Then he walked away, disappearing into the kitchen. Ethan looked down. A tiny smile flickered across his face before disappearing just as quickly. Across the street, Damien stepped onto the sidewalk. Then he stopped. Through the restaurant window, he watched Leo reach toward the untouched glass, his fingers wrapping around the cool surface. At that exact moment, Gabriel shouted into his earpiece. Boss, don't let him drink it. Boss, don't let him drink it. Gabriel's warning exploded through Damien's earpiece. For a split second, the world seemed to freeze. Through the restaurant window, Damien watched Leo wrap his fingers around the sparkling water. He smiled politely at Ethan as he lifted the glass, his omega scent brightening with casual happiness. Damien didn't think. He moved. The restaurant doors burst open so violently that every conversation inside stopped. Heads turned. Forks froze halfway to mouths. The pianist in the corner missed 3 notes before falling silent. A waitress dropped a tray of glasses, shattering them on the floor. Damien Moretti strode through the dining room with the controlled urgency of a man who had already calculated every possible outcome. His dark coat swept behind him like a shadow. Marco and 2 security men entered seconds later, silently sealing every exit. The air crackled with alpha aggression and barely restrained violence. Most of the guests recognized him immediately. Whispers spread through the room like wildfire. That's Damien Moretti. Why is he here? What happened? Is that the Mafia boss? Leo looked up in surprise. Sir. Before he could stand, Damien reached the table. Without saying a single word, he took the glass from Leo's hand. He smelled it once, his nostrils flaring as he caught the faint chemical tang, then calmly poured the water into a nearby decorative flower pot. Within seconds, the plant's leaves began to curl. The stem darkened. The petals wilted and blackened. A waitress screamed. The restaurant erupted into chaos. Guests pushed back their chairs. Marcus's men moved to block the exits. The kitchen doors banged open as chefs peered out in confusion. Leo stared at the dying plant in disbelief. What? Damien turned toward Ethan. His expression was colder than winter. You came prepared. Ethan remained seated. To his credit, he didn't panic. I have no idea what you're talking about. No. Damien placed a small evidence bag on the table. Inside lay a nearly invisible, dissolvable capsule. Our chemist found an identical capsule inside the serving tray used by your waiter. Fast-acting, odorless, tasteless. It would have had him unconscious within 60 seconds. The fake smile disappeared from Ethan's face. His calm demeanor cracked, revealing something sharp and calculating beneath. Marco quietly addressed the stunned restaurant manager. Please ask everyone to remain calm. This is now a private security matter. Several guests immediately stood to leave. The security team politely but firmly blocked the exits. No one argued. Not after seeing the dead plant. Not after seeing Damien Moretti's cold, murderous expression. Leo slowly looked between Damien and Ethan. Confusion flooded his face. Ethan? What's happening? Ethan sighed. Then he smiled a completely different smile. Cold. Calculated. Predatory. So, I suppose the evening is over. Leo's stomach tightened. You knew? He shrugged. I knew enough. Damien stepped between them, positioning himself as a shield between Leo and the Alpha. You used him. Ethan laughed quietly. I preferred the word recruited. I never intended to hurt him. No. Damien's voice hardened. You intended to use him until he became disposable. You intended to drug him, take him somewhere private, and extract everything he knows about my security protocols. Leo shook his head. No. This doesn't make sense. I don't know anything. I'm just a maid. Ethan replied. You didn't. You were simply the easiest path into the Moretti estate. He looked at Leo with something that might have been pity. You're the only person in that mansion who matters to him. The only weakness in his entire organization. You were our way in. Every color drained from Leo's face. My friend. Caleb. Ethan nodded. We approached him 6 months ago. He believed he was helping you meet someone nice. He never knew who we really were. He still doesn't know. Tears immediately filled Leo's eyes. He was tricked too? Yes. Damien answered before Ethan could. Victor Salvatore specializes in manipulating ordinary people. They create fake identities, manufacture trust, and wait. They find the cracks in someone's life and exploit them. Caleb wasn't at fault. He was targeted just like you. Leo slowly lowered himself back into his chair. Everything suddenly made sense. The coincidence. The perfect conversation. The strangely specific questions about the estate. He had nearly answered them. He almost helped them. Not because he was careless. Because he honestly believed someone had simply wanted to know him. A tear rolled down his cheek. I was so stupid. No. Damien's answer came instantly. You were kind. There is a difference. Kindness isn't weakness, Leo. It's courage. It's choosing to trust even when the world has given you reasons not to. Leo looked up at him. For just a moment, the restaurant disappeared. The frightened guests. The armed guards. The rival operative. None of it mattered. He saw only Damien standing between him and danger without a second's hesitation. He saw the Alpha's protective rage, the possessive gleam in his eyes, the way his scent flared with an intensity that made Leo's Omega instincts purr. Ethan slowly rose from his chair. You know, I almost feel bad. Damien didn't move. You should. Ethan chuckled. Do you know what surprised me most? You. He looked directly at Damien. Our reports described you as cold, strategic, impossible to provoke. The heartless Mafia boss. The untouchable Alpha. But all we had to do, he glanced toward Leo, was invite your maid to dinner. The room fell silent. Even Marco looked toward Damien. Ethan smiled wider. You've been in love with him for a very long time. Damien said nothing. He didn't deny it. That silence told everyone everything. Leo's eyes widened. He stared at Damien as though seeing him for the first time. All those mornings. All those loaves of bread. All those small gestures he had dismissed as routine. The coffee. The reminders. The way Damien always finished his breakfast, even when he wasn't hungry. The way he watched Leo across the room. The way his scent softened whenever Leo entered the study. Ethan laughed. I spent months studying your organization. I never found your weakness. Turns out, it wasn't your shipping routes. It wasn't your money. It wasn't your soldiers. It was the Omega who baked your bread every Sunday. Several diners exchanged shocked glances. Marco slowly closed his eyes. So that's how the entire city finds out. Damien took one deliberate step forward. You've said enough. At that moment, 3 men wearing restaurant uniforms suddenly reached beneath their jackets. Weapons. The diners screamed before the first pistol cleared its holster. Marco tackled one attacker across a table. Gabriel disarmed another with a precise strike to the wrist. Damien moved faster than Leo could follow. He grabbed Leo's chair and pulled it behind him, shielding him completely with his own body. His alpha scent exploded with protective fury, a wall of sheer dominance that made Leo's Omega instincts submit without thought. The third attacker hesitated. His weapon pointed directly at Damien. No one breathed. No one moved. Then dozens of red laser dots appeared across the man's chest. The restaurant windows shattered inward. Moretti security had surrounded the entire building. The attacker slowly dropped his gun, his face pale with fear. It's over, Gabriel said. Within moments, police sirens echoed outside. Victor Salvatore's operation had collapsed. Ethan was handcuffed without resistance. As officers escorted him away, he looked back one final time. You won tonight, Moretti. But ask yourself one question. If he never told you about this date, would you ever have admitted how much he meant to you? The doors closed behind him. Silence returned. Leo remained standing beside the table. His hands trembled. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was overwhelmed. His Omega instincts were in chaos, caught between fear and relief, and something that felt dangerously like hope. He looked at Damien. So, you followed me. Marco quietly muttered. Here we go. Damien answered honestly. Yes. You investigated Ethan? Yes. You had people watching me? Yes. Leo took one slow step backward. Pain replaced confusion. You didn't trust me. Damien's expression changed for the first time all evening. The ice cracked, revealing something raw and vulnerable beneath. It was never about trusting you. But I didn't know that. Leo's voice cracked. You could have told me. You could have warned me. Instead, you watched. You let me walk into danger without telling me why. I didn't know it was danger. Not until tonight. That doesn't change anything. Leo shook his head. I thought tonight was about finally letting someone into my life. I thought it was about taking a risk, stepping outside my safe little bubble. I didn't realize everyone else already knew more about it than I did. With tears threatening to fall, Leo turned and walked toward the restaurant exit. His Omega scent was bitter with hurt and confusion. Damien instinctively stepped after him, then stopped. For perhaps the first time in years, the most powerful alpha in the city realized there was one battle no amount of money, influence, or force could win. The battle for the heart of the Omega he had just protected. The Moretti estate had never felt so quiet. Not because the staff were afraid, but because someone was missing. 3 days had passed since the incident at the restaurant. The rival syndicate's operation had collapsed. Victor Salvatore's network had suffered its worst intelligence failure in years. Ethan Cross had accepted a plea agreement in exchange for testimony. The immediate danger was over. Yet Damien felt no sense of victory. Every morning, he still walked into his study before sunrise. Every morning, a fresh cup of coffee waited on his desk. One of the housekeepers faithfully prepared it. It tasted exactly the same. But somehow it wasn't right. The bread came from the estate kitchen, perfectly baked, perfectly warm. Yet Damien left it untouched. He had no appetite. His alpha instincts were restless, pacing inside him like a caged animal. The bond that had never been formalized, never been claimed, still hummed with unfinished business. Marco eventually walked into the study carrying several documents. You've ignored breakfast 3 days in a row. I'm busy. You've signed the same contract twice. Damien looked down. Marco was right. His signature appeared on both pages. Something he had never done before. His hand cramped from gripping the pen so hard. Marco gently placed the paperwork aside. You should go see him. Damien stared out the window. I already frightened him once. If I push again, I'll lose him completely. Marco smiled. You know what I find interesting? Damien raised an eyebrow. You've negotiated peace treaties between criminal families. You've stared down judges. You've survived assassination attempts. But one disappointed housemaid, he chuckled softly, has completely defeated Damien Moretti. For the first time in days, Damien smiled. Only briefly. He's not just a housemaid. I know. I've known for 3 years. The question is, when will you admit it to him? Meanwhile, Leo sat inside a small neighborhood bakery. The comforting smell of fresh cinnamon surrounded him, but it brought him no comfort. Caleb stirred his coffee nervously, his face pale with guilt. I'm so sorry. Leo reached across the table and squeezed his friend's hand. This wasn't your fault. I should have checked. No. Leo shook his head firmly. They fooled both of us. They knew exactly what they were doing. You were trying to help me. That's not something to apologize for. Caleb hesitated. So, what are you going to do now? Leo looked out the window. Snow had begun to fall, soft white flakes drifting past the glass. I don't know. I miss the estate. I miss everyone. He stopped. Caleb smiled knowingly. And Leo looked down at his untouched tea. I miss him. The word surprised even him. He remembered every small moment he had dismissed over the years. The mornings Damien quietly finished breakfast after insisting he wasn't hungry. The evenings he pretended not to notice the fresh bread waiting outside his office. The winter afternoon he silently draped his own coat across Leo's shoulders when the heating system failed. The birthday gift that had arrived anonymously. A set of professional baking tools Leo had admired months earlier. He had always assumed someone from the kitchen purchased them. Now he wasn't so sure. He's never been honest with me, Leo said quietly. He's always hidden, always guarded. And I understand why. His life is dangerous, and he's been betrayed so many times. But I can't be someone's secret. I can't be something he hides from the world. Caleb nodded slowly. Have you ever considered that maybe he's not hiding you from the world? Maybe he's hiding himself from you. Leo blinked. What? I've worked at that estate for 2 years. I've seen him when you're in the room. He watches you. He tracks your movements. He smiles when you smile. His entire demeanor changes around you. Caleb leaned forward. That's not the behavior of a man who's indifferent. That's the behavior of a man who's terrified. Terrified of what? Of being hurt. Of being rejected. Of letting someone in and having them leave. Caleb's voice was gentle. He's never had anyone like you, Leo. He doesn't know how to do this. Leo was quiet for a long moment. He should have told me the truth. He should have. But maybe he didn't know how. Maybe he was afraid that if he admitted how he felt, you'd run. Back at the estate, Gabriel entered Damien's office carrying an old cardboard box. We found this while reorganizing storage. It was in the back of one of the supply closets. Damien looked inside. His breath caught in his throat. Small handwritten recipe cards. Every loaf of bread Leo had baked over the past 3 years. Each recipe carried notes in Leo's careful handwriting. Less salt. He doesn't like it too salty. Add extra butter. He was frowning today. Boss actually finished this one. Finally. Try rosemary next Sunday. I think he'd like it. Another card read. He looked tired today. Add extra honey. Maybe he'll eat more. And another. He skipped lunch again. I'll leave this near his desk. Damien carefully picked up the final card. The handwriting was smaller, almost hidden in one corner, as though Leo hadn't intended anyone to read it. I wish he'd stop pretending he has to carry everything alone. I wish he'd let me help. I wish he'd let me in. For a long moment, Damien simply stood there. Then he quietly closed the box. Prepare the car. An hour later, the bell above the bakery door chimed softly. Leo looked up. Every conversation inside stopped. Damien Moretti stood in the doorway. No bodyguards. No convoy. No expensive overcoat. Just one alpha carrying a plain brown paper bag. He wore a simple black sweater and dark jeans. Casual, vulnerable, stripped of all his usual armor. Snow dusted his shoulders. His alpha scent was subdued, anxious, almost apologetic. He walked toward Leo's table. May I sit? Leo nodded, his throat tight. For several seconds, neither spoke. Finally, Damien placed the paper bag on the table. Inside lay one slightly burned loaf of bread. It was misshapen, lopsided. The crust was too dark in some places and too pale in others. Leo blinked. You baked this? I tried. Damien's voice was rough. It took me 6 tries. I burned the first 5. The kitchen staff probably thinks I've lost my mind. A tiny laugh escaped Leo despite everything. It's terrible. I know. It collapsed. The crust is uneven, and I may have confused sugar with salt. Damien's mouth twitched. I'm not good at this. Leo smiled wider. I can tell. Damien looked directly into his eyes. I finally understood something. When you weren't there, the mansion kept running. The business kept growing. The money kept coming. He paused, but it stopped feeling like home. Leo's smile slowly faded. Damien continued quietly. I thought I was protecting an employee. I was lying to myself. I was protecting the Omega I couldn't imagine losing. His voice remained calm, yet every word carried absolute honesty. I wasn't angry because you had a date. I was terrified. Terrified that someone else might discover what I realized too late. He took a slow breath. That's somewhere between your reminders to take my medication, your arguments over breakfast, and every loaf of bread you quietly left outside my office. I fell in love with you. The bakery fell completely silent. Even the barista stopped pretending not to listen. The other customers stared openly. Leo felt tears fill his eyes. You should have told me. I know. I was afraid. Damien's voice cracked slightly. I've faced down enemies. I've survived assassination attempts. I've stared death in the face without flinching. But the thought of telling you how I felt, it paralyzed me. I couldn't do it. I kept waiting for the right moment. I kept convincing myself there would be time. Leo laughed softly through his tears. The most feared alpha in the city was afraid. Damien smiled. Only of one Omega. Leo stood. He walked around the table. Then, without hesitation, he wrapped his arms around Damien and held him tight. Not because Damien was powerful. Not because he had rescued him. Because for the first time, he had allowed himself to be vulnerable. Leo rested his forehead against Damien's. I don't need a bodyguard. I don't need a mansion. I don't need a mafia boss. I only need the alpha who secretly ate my bread every Sunday. Damien laughed, a genuine laugh. One his employees had almost never heard. I ate it every single time. Even when I wasn't hungry. Even when I was angry. Even when I didn't want to admit that you were the only good thing in my life. Leo kissed him. Softly, gently, sweetly. His Omega scent, vanilla and honey and fresh bread, brightened with happiness, flooding the bakery with warmth and contentment. When they finally pulled apart, Damien cupped Leo's face in his hands. I'm not going to hide anymore. I'm not going to pretend you're just an employee. I'm going to tell everyone. The staff. The board. The entire damn city if I have to. Leo laughed. That's a lot of people. I don't care. I want them to know you're mine. Damien's alpha instincts purred with satisfaction. I want them to know I'm yours. Several months later, the Moretti estate looked exactly the same. The gardens bloomed. The staff hurried through familiar hallways. Fresh bread filled the kitchen with its comforting aroma. Only one thing had changed. During the annual charity gala, reporters gathered outside the mansion gates. One journalist asked the inevitable question. Mr. Moretti, there have been rumors. Who is the Omega standing beside you? Damien looked toward Leo. He was no longer wearing a maid's uniform. Instead, he stood confidently in an elegant midnight blue suit, still smiling with the same warmth that had first transformed Damien's lonely mornings. A faint omega scent of vanilla and honey drifted through the air, his natural pheromones, no longer suppressed, blooming with contentment. A delicate silver band glinted on his finger. Damien gently took his hand. His answer was simple. This is Leo Brooks. He smiled proudly. The Omega who taught me that fear isn't losing an empire. It's losing the person who makes coming home worth it. The cameras flashed. The estate staff applauded. Leo's cheeks flushed pink. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper only Damien could hear. You're going to make me cry. Damien's thumb traced slow circles across his knuckles. Then let them see. Let everyone see how happy you make me. Leo's scent sweetened with emotion, unmistakable, utterly honest. The bond between them, newly marked just weeks ago, hummed with quiet satisfaction. Damien inhaled deeply, letting the familiar comfort of his Omega wash over him. Marco quietly whispered to Gabriel. I told him he was jealous. Gabriel smirked. You told him on day one. Leo laughed. Damien kissed his forehead, his alpha instincts purring with possessive satisfaction. For the first time in many years, the most feared mansion in the city finally became a home. Later that evening, after the last guests had departed and the staff had retreated to their quarters, Damien found Leo in the kitchen. The Omega stood at the counter, kneading dough with practiced ease, flour dusting his forearms. His scent was warm, content, utterly at peace. Damien leaned against the doorway, watching. You're baking at midnight. Leo glanced up, smiling. I couldn't sleep. Thought I'd make something for tomorrow. He paused, then added softly, for you. Damien crossed the room, pressing himself against Leo's back, arms wrapping around his waist. He nuzzled into the curve of Leo's neck, inhaling deeply, letting the Omega's scent soothe his restless alpha instincts. I don't deserve you. Leo laughed, leaning back into him. You keep saying that. Because it's true. Leo turned in his arms, hands still dusted with flour, and reached up to cup Damien's face. You saved my life. You showed up in that restaurant without hesitation. You've spent months proving that you see me, not as a servant, not as a weakness, but as your partner. Damien's eyes darkened with emotion. You're my mate, Leo. My home. My everything. Leo's breath caught. Even now, weeks after the claiming bite, those words made his Omega heart race. He rose on his toes and pressed a soft kiss to Damien's lips. Then stop punishing yourself. Stay here. Stay with me. Damien captured his mouth in a deeper kiss, tasting cinnamon and sugar and something uniquely Leo. His hands slid beneath Leo's shirt, fingers splaying across the warm skin of his back. Leo melted into him with a soft Omega whimper, submissive, trusting, utterly his. Always, Damien murmured against his lips. I'm not going anywhere. I'm never going anywhere. 3 months later, the estate buzzed with quiet excitement. Leo had officially moved out of the staff quarters and into the master suite. The transition had been gradual, a toothbrush in the bathroom here, a favorite sweater on the chair there, but the announcement still sent ripples through the household. Olivia cornered Leo in the hallway, grinning. So, it's official. Leo blushed, tucking a curl behind his ear. What do you mean? You're not a maid anymore. She lowered her voice conspiratorially. You're practically the Omega of the house. Leo laughed. I'm still baking bread, Olivia. Nothing's changed. Everything's changed. She hugged him tightly. And I'm so happy for you. You deserve this. You deserve him. That evening, Damien found Leo in the study, curled up in the leather armchair with a book. The Omega looked up as he entered, his smile soft and welcoming. The bond between them pulsed with shared contentment, a warm glow that never quite faded. Damien knelt before the chair, taking Leo's hands in his. I've been thinking. Leo raised an eyebrow. Dangerous. Damien laughed, something he did so easily now, so naturally. I want to make this permanent. Official. In every way that matters. Leo's eyes widened. Damien, I'm not proposing, not yet. I want to do that properly, with rings and candles and everything you deserve. He squeezed Leo's hands. But I want everyone to know. I want to claim you publicly. Not just in private, not just in the bond. I want the world to see that you're mine and I'm yours. Leo's eyes glistened. You already have me. I know. Damien pressed a kiss to his knuckles. That's why I want to shout it from every rooftop. Leo laughed, tears spilling over. You're impossible. Impossibly in love with you. Damien agreed. The ceremony was small, intimate, held in the estate's private garden under a canopy of fairy lights and blooming jasmine. The scent of flowers mingled with the warmth of their bond, creating a bubble of perfect happiness. Marco served as witness. Gabriel officiated. The entire staff lined the path, holding candles and smiling. Damien wore a dark suit, simple and elegant. Leo wore ivory, soft linen that caught the moonlight. Their scents intertwined, alpha and omega, power and grace, strength and tenderness. When it was done, when the bond was sealed with words and a gentle kiss, Damien pulled Leo close and whispered against his ear, I love you. I've loved you since the first morning you brought me bread. I just didn't know how to say it. Leo laughed, tears streaming down his cheeks. You showed me. You always showed me. And as they danced beneath the stars, surrounded by the family they had built, both of them knew this was only the beginning. The years that followed were not always easy. Damien's world was still dangerous. Enemies still lurked in the shadows. But Leo was no longer a servant hiding in the background. He had become a partner, a confidant, a source of strength. He learned to navigate the complexities of Damien's life with grace and courage. He learned to stand beside an alpha who had once terrified the entire city. And Damien, cold, ruthless, untouchable Damien Moretti, learned to smile, to laugh, to let someone in. He learned that love wasn't weakness. It was the greatest strength of all. Every morning, without fail, fresh bread still appeared on his breakfast table. Warm, golden, perfectly baked. And every morning, Damien ate every single slice, because it was made by the omega he loved, and it tasted like home.